So I could just hear people talking, coming up in the elevator and in the hallways. When you get to be 2 to the 6th years, you can't find any good science to talk about, so you got to talk about the past. But that's not true, it turns out. And I could have talked to you about SOAR, all right? So let's start. This is actually work by Bob Dornbos and Mellon Tomby. And so here we have a program of about 2,000 productions, and it runs from 0 decision cycles, which is its basic cycle time, on up to 50,000 decision cycles, and it's chunking all the way. And so here's the number of chunks built. And so it's actually built 8,000 chunks by now. So you're looking at one of the largest production systems ever built. And so the real interesting question is, what's true out there? Okay? And so as all of you know in this school, in this department, the way SOAR is built out of a big production system, and thus there is behind SOAR a huge set of rules. 10,000 of them by the time you take the 2,000 original and 8,000. There's a big ReaderNet there, which is a device for trying to execute those rules efficiently. And so here's a picture for the same thing, which shows the growth of nodes in the ReaderNet. And there's about 20,000 nodes to begin with, and we're getting up towards 130,000, 125,000 nodes at the end. So the ReaderNet is really big. Okay, and you don't want to look at these. There is within each task that it runs, there are some internal things that get created for support. So you really want to look only at the envelope, the underneath envelope, okay? So now if you believe everybody, that system should be slowing down like mad, okay, as it gets so big. That's the Steve Minton story, for those of you who remember Steve Minton. So here we have the time per decision cycle in seconds, printed on a log scale. And in fact, as you look, there's essentially no indication of what we call the average growth effect. No indication that things are slowing down, even though we're already up to about 10,000 productions. Actually, we've been tracking this as we're getting big. When you look here, there's absolutely no indication. Now, maybe you can begin to see that we're finally going to get some average growth effect. So here we have a really big production system, and of course we're just getting started, and we will soon find out what it's out like when it's sort of out to here or out to here, when we get 20,000 productions. So I could have told you about all these things, okay? But when Merrick asked me to give this lecture, and I think this was a form letter he sends to everybody, he said, why don't you step back? Instead of just talking about your technical thing, why don't you talk about something sort of more general that reflects upon the larger issues. So that's what I decided to do. After all, if I look at myself and I measure myself in decision cycles, and you believe the SOAR theory of cognition, then I'm running at about 10 to the 9th decision cycles. This thing is only running at 10 to the 5th decision cycle, 10 to the 4th decision cycles. So I've got quite a bit of extra time going than it does, and so I probably am more interesting than it is. I think it'll be quite a while before we get that system out to 10 to the 9th decision cycle. Well, it's chunking one chunk every 6 decision cycles. That linear curve showed that. Extrapolate out and multiply it by 10 to the 5th, so I've got 10,000 times 10 to the 5th. That's 10 to the 8th chunks. I've got 10 to the 8th chunks, not counting my first 18 years when presumably I was learning nothing, all right? So I said I will reflect on my, not just on my career, but on sort of scientific styles, which might be interesting to the group at hand, since most of you either haven't yet adopted a scientific style or probably don't like the one that you're in. So let's talk about scientific styles of scientific lives. There are a bunch of floating maxims around when we do this. The maxim associated with this slide is to each scientific life its own style, but each style defines a separate life, okay? So I want to just talk about different styles because I only exhibit one of these and there are lots of other styles. So the first one is the one I actually associate with algorithm complexity theorists, which I call a nomadic existence. Turns out that it's easy to prove theorems, and it's very hard to prove theorems that are not almost like the theorems that everybody else has proved. So every so often in complexity theory, someone proves a really new interesting theorem which opens up a new area. And then everybody picks up their tents and they all run over into this new area, and they pick up all the interesting nuggets around, and pretty soon you look around and there's nothing around except nuggets that are like everybody else's nuggets. Then finally somebody gets a new one, everyone picks up their tents, okay? And that's the way you live your life. Okay, you live your life moving from one theoretical area to another as it opens up. Second kind of scientific style is sort of a general substantive theme. Gordon Bell actually is a pretty interesting thing, although he's moved a little bit. He really played out the first half of his career understanding what the nature of computer architectures was. That has shifted for the last 15 or 20 years into understanding multiprocessors. He's not focused on any particular thing. There is no particular machine that he wants to build. He wants to understand the space of multiprocessors and how to build effective multiprocessors. That is, in one sense, a kind of a lifetime effort of his, although when I talked to him recently, he was sort of running out of gas and asking what to do next. There is another style that's quite different, which I've labeled a sequence of strategic objectives. A kind of paradigm example was a scientist I knew about 20 years ago by the name of Werner Reichert, who at the time I knew him was studying the control system in insects that governed their flight. His view of the world, he was very articulate, was that you pick a particular scientific idea. That idea takes of the order of 5 years to build up and get deep enough so you really can do something, and then you pick another one. So life for Werner is a sequence of 5 years, nominally 5 years projects, each one picked by looking at the state of science at the time. There are, in fact, their number is legion, a number of people, and I see lots of them around here, for whom the goal is simply to work on interesting problems. Okay, you simply, in fact, if you can work on interesting problems, that's all you ask of each particular day. There's another variation on this, which is not so pleasant, in which you look at whatever seems publishable. If you see a little project in life that looks like it's publishable, let's go for that one, okay? And I know a number of people whose scientific lives are a random walk among the publishable materials. They, of course, shall all be nameless. The last style I want to discuss is a single ultimate scientific question in which a scientist adopts a real goal out there, a scientific goal. I have 3 examples. Herb Simon is now famous for the fact that a single scientific goal of understanding how it is that humans who are governed by bounded rationality, how all of the phenomena surrounding human cognition and decision-making can be understood by that. That is, in fact, has driven his entire scientific career. I haven't checked this one out with Raj, but my belief about Raj is that he really has speech recognition as his only fundamental scientific goal. Okay? Now, Raj does lots of different things. He works on multimedia, works on vision, he's worked on robotics. Only when he turns back to speech do you see sort of fantastic and interesting thing happens, and he keeps coming back to it. So for Raj, I infer, and I repeat, I didn't ask him, I infer that his life is not all those things. It is really speech as the thing that he wants to really see done with his scientific life. And for myself, I'm again one of these types of characters. My style is to deal with a single problem, namely the nature of the human mind. That is the one problem that I have cared about throughout my scientific career, and it will last me all the way to the end. So let's look at that a little bit. So my style is the pursuit of a single desire. That's the desire of the title. It is the nature of the human mind. The maxim is that science is in the details. Okay? Now, what is this question? For me, this question is, how can human mind occur in the physical universe? We now know that the world is governed by physics. We now understand the way biology nestles comfortably within that. The issue is, how will mind do that as well? And the second part of this is this answer must have the details. I've got to know how the gears clank and how the pistons go and all the rest of that detail. That's that question for I, and it's not the same as a bunch of other questions. For instance, it's not the same as what is the nature of intelligence. That is the AI question. And although I have been associated with AI for a large part of my life, that's not the question that drives me. This is the question that drives me, and they're not the same. It's not the Simon question, which is essentially, this is kind of an abbreviated version to get it into a single line. How does bounded rationality explain all of human behavior? It's not the same question as that, although, of course, those questions are close enough so that Herb and I have managed a collaboration for 40 years. But in fact, it leads me, my question leads me down to worry about the architecture. It leads Herb to worry about other areas of human life and how to explain them in terms of bounded rationality. It is also not the issue of the nature, or it's not the issue of the mind-body problem. That's the philosopher's question. Now, they may have the same answer. It may be that the answer to my question and the answer to their question is the same. But it turns out, of course, that my question is a simple scientific question. It may be an ultimate one and hard to get at, but it is a scientific question. And the mind-body is not. It's a philosophical question. And in fact, if the mind-body were cast as a scientific question, all the philosophers would do different things than they now do about it. They'd go up in the laboratory, for instance. But it's also not what is the nature of the brain. That's another question which may have exactly the same answer, mostly because there's really only one answer out there, all right? The same answer, but in fact, if this was the question, I would be doing things very different than the way I'm doing them. Now, you do need to realize, if you haven't before, that there is this sort of collection of ultimate scientific questions, and if you're lucky enough to get grabbed by one of these, that will just do you for the rest of their life. Why does the universe exist? When did it start? What's the nature of life? Why is evolution so stable? All of these things are questions of a depth about the nature of our universe that they can hold you for an entire life, and you're then just a little ways into them. That's not true. There are, in fact, some of these, what is the nature of life, which have been essentially answered compared to where they were 100 years ago. There are some other rather interesting ones in this list, like to see an atom. There were a number of people, not too many, whose real goal in life was to finally see an atom. Having been told by the philosophers that atoms and electrons and all the rest of those things were mere creations of the human mind, and they weren't really out there, then what do you want to do? Well, you want to go see one, because if you see one, then in fact you know it's as real as a chair. And that's, of course, happened now, and you probably take it all for granted. So this, in fact, all four of these, well, Herb's question is very interesting, because nobody ever quite posed the question that way before Herb did, whereas all the rest of these are sort of obvious questions. They're just deep questions. So there's the desire. A question that gets asked naturally at that point is, if that's what scientific life is, when did it start? For me, okay? So the maxim here is that the scientific problem chooses you, you don't choose it. You don't go pick a scientific problem and decide that you are going to go and understand the nature of the human mind. For me, it was certainly not the problem at age 17, where what I wanted to be most was a forest ranger. And as a matter of fact, I spent one summer up in the high Sierras being one of those kinds, except what I actually did was to take gangrenous calves' livers, frozen, and chop them up and grind them up so that the trout fingerlings could have something to eat for a summer. Didn't seem like a great career to me. It certainly was not at age 19 when I wanted to be, I say, a scientist. I was out at Bikini at the time. That's the place where the atomic bomb testing was done. And in the company of all kinds of scientists and medical doctors and so forth concerned with this. And I was clearly caught up in the excitement, although I hardly knew what it was to be a scientist. But I certainly wanted to be one of those. In fact, I was probably a good example of, I want to work on interesting problems, okay? I suppose that's actually a Chinese scientist. All right. It was not at age 22 when I wanted most of all to be an optical engineer. Now that's an optical engineer. Who would ever want to be an optical engineer? Well, it turns out, as an undergraduate at Stanford, I worked on X-ray microscopy. And most of you think of an X-ray as something which goes through a material, so you can't build a microscope with it. You can't bend the waves. But it turns out that if you take a surface and you shine the X-rays at a glancing angle, you can get enough index of reflection so you can actually focus the X-rays and make an X-ray microscope. And I was all caught up in the engineering and the physics of doing this as an undergraduate for several years, and therefore I clearly wanted to be an optical engineer. It hadn't happened yet at age 27, where what I wanted to be was an organizational scientist. Now by this time, I actually was a scientist. As John McDermott would say, I actually are one, okay? Because in fact we had started to study large social organizations. These were air defense organizations. This was right in the time of the Cold War, and we were studying, there were radar systems all up and down the coast, and we were studying the behavior and performance of those 40-man organizations as they tried to interpret the air picture flowing in as seen through their radars. And I was engaged in organizational experiments, and they were very successful and very interesting. And at that point, I clearly wanted to be an organizational scientist. But it didn't happen then. It actually happened at age 27.7. On a Friday afternoon, and I can't remember quite which Friday it was, but on a Friday afternoon in mid-November, and another fellow by the name of Oliver Selfridge came to Rand. I was at Rand at the time, and he talked about their system. They were producing a system on what was called the memory test computer for Whirlwind, and they were building a pattern recognition system which had several loops of self-adaptation in it. And I listened, and this wasn't a big seminar. He just got in a room with about 3 or 4 of us and described this effort for a couple of hours. And I listened to that, and I knew, okay, this is a genuine conversion experience. I walked out of that place. What I knew actually was that computers can do any kind of complex processing, including learning, abstraction, you name it. That was the collection of mechanisms there were sufficiently rich that we were on our way, okay? It was indeed a conversion experience, and I'm an apostate Christian, so I can tell you I've been through conversion experiences before, and this is one of those. I went into the office of my colleague, Cliff Shaw. We weren't, of course, colleagues on AI at that time, but we had been working together on the simulations that we were doing for this sort of thing. And I repeated verbatim practically what Oliver Selfridge had said in the previous hour. Then I went home that weekend and I designed a couple of whole systems from scratch, and I've never turned back since. Okay, so that's what I mean by saying that the scientific problem chooses you, you don't choose it. I suppose you can say, well, I certainly was engaged in a hell of a search during all of the early years of my life when I finally came home in that 1 hour. Now the insight, of course, was not the nature of the human mind. That was already there from the kind of organizational studies. It was that we could understand by mechanistic means how the mind could operate. Now, as I sort of went over this thing, an odd insight's the wrong word, an odd notion occurred to me. This is November 54. That's only about a year and a half before what is usually considered this great burst of activity. The logic theorist, list processing invented and used, GPS, general problem solver, invented and used, the chess program occurred all in the course of a year. That's only about a year away, year and a half away from that thing. And absolutely nothing, if you go back and examine that, presages why this burst of activity should occur. Very compressed in time. So there we are. So there's desire, and we've got it started. Finally got me quitting wandering around and on target. But then there are diversions, okay? And so the maxim is diversions occur. They really do, and all you can do is to make them count. And then you can salvage whatever is possible for your main goal. So I want to illustrate that. So here's the first diversion. Gordon Bell came to town, gotten tired of DEC, and so he showed up, and he couldn't stand going to MIT. So he showed up here at CMU to be a professor for a while, and so he was writing a book about all his experience in building machines, and he came around and he gave me a chapter. And I read this chapter, and it was so awful you cannot imagine. I don't know how many of you have heard Gordon speak, but Gordon kind of speaks like this all the time, okay? And he writes worse, okay? So he's a new faculty member. He's supposed to be nice to new faculty members. You know, that's kind of the culture. So I started to edit this manuscript for Gordon to help him out. And now Gordon, in fact, will organize anything that moves slower than he is, okay? And so first thing I knew, I was co-opted as a co-author, and there I was with a real diversion on my hand, because this book was out of control from the beginning, okay? And as you can see, this is essentially, what is that, 6 years. 6 years that this effort went on. So you got to make it count. Now what actually happened was that within that, for entirely bookish reasons, because we couldn't stand the plethora of notations from all the different reprints that we were doing, we invented two notations called PMS and ISP. Most of you know what ISP is, instruction set processor language. That has become, in fact, a fairly standard term. Probably nobody knows what PMS is anymore, standing for Processor Memory Switch Language, a language of computer configurations. But both of these were major scientific contributions. That's what I mean by making it count. As far as salvage was concerned, I took one big thing out of this, 6, 7 years experience. Namely, I understood what architectures were about. I don't think I understood what architecture is about when I went in, and in fact, the field didn't either. One of the things that book did was to help pull together a nascent notion within the computer field about architectures and the space of architectures. And that's really one of the main contributions of the book. But I sort of salvaged this little piece from this huge effort. All right. So here's my second diversion, which is Raj Reddy and the speech understanding systems. That again goes from 7 years, 1970 to 76. There was a small part of this which was trying to help the DARPA community, which needed to have a head of a little committee to tell it to do speech understanding research when what it knew it wanted to do was speech understanding research. That's the function of committees in our society, is when everyone knows what they want to do, you create a committee to tell you. And since I was innocent of this whole thing, Larry Roberts sort of tapped me. But the real reason, it turns out, was that Raj was here. Raj was one of the people who deeply knew he wanted to work on speech recognition research. So in fact, the diversion was really to help Raj as well. Okay, in fact, if I tell you privately now that the whole thing is over, it was more to help Raj than to help the DARPA community. So we ran this speech understanding thing. I ended up being chairman of the steering committee. I ended up writing a goddamn book about the whole thing. On and on it went. It was, in some sense, in its own terms, it was indeed a major success. All I got out of it, that's the salvage part, all I got out of it was at least I understood sensory processing a little bit, which I'd never understood before, and that helps me a little bit in understanding the nature of human cognition and so forth. But again, in terms of the maxim, if you're going to go be diverted, make it count. And we made the speech understanding system count. So let's go on. Lots of diversions. So here's the third diversion. This is Stu Card and Tom Moran and the psychology of HCI. Again, lasted for 11 years, all right? One of the points I will make, I might as well make it now, is these diversions seem to last a long time. And since the point of diversions is don't let them really get in the way, always come back to the main goal, it really pays to have a long life, okay? So the diversion was, Newell, my wife, and I are both creatures of San Francisco, both born and raised in San Francisco, so we're West Coasters, and worse than that, okay? San Francisco at that time was a very attractive place, and Pittsburgh was not so attractive as it is now. So there sort of was a need to get something on the West Coast that would help us sort of go back there all the time. So that was the diversion. And so we generated, when Xerox PARC came into existence in 1970, 71, we generated a consultantship out there, and we invented the notion that maybe it was time to apply all that we understood about cognition to some area, like how humans interacted with computers, or how they did programming, or something like that. And then I convinced two of my graduate students, Stu Card and Tom Moran here, that what they wanted most in the world was to go out and join me at Xerox PARC. Well, I stayed here and just consulted out there, of course. And we would create this little unit to go build this thing. All right, so that's all diversion. Now, it turns out that on the uses side, we sort of developed strongly and early, 1975, 76, the notion of routine cognitive skills. We devoted a class of models called GOMS for characterizing when humans are operating in a routine fashion in a cognitive skill. We helped establish, there wasn't enough room over here to say it, but we actually helped establish the whole field of HCI as an endeavor. In fact, the title of our book, which is called Human-Computer Interaction, is sort of the first major use of that term as far as I'm aware. So, you know, there we are again. If you're going to be diverted, at least make good use of it. Now, what did I salvage? I actually salvaged quite a bit from this effort. Bonnie won't probably like my talking about it as salvage, but that's all right. A piece of this, a kind of a little add-on piece of this, was the developing of something called the model human processor, which is an attempt to kind of characterize, from what psychology knew, cognitive psychology, all the activities that occurred in the human as they were interacting with the machine. And that gave me a view of what it would be to have a unified theory of cognition. Okay? So I had a real activity, a presaging activity, that set me up for understanding that when I came back to that a number of years later. So I actually salvaged a lot out of that one. Well, there's at least one more diversion. This is Zog. Don McCracken and George Robertson in a system called Zog. The diversion is, again, two great graduate students in a system which nobody has heard about called LSAR. We won't come to LSAR very much, but I'll touch on it. In which, for a number of odd reasons, but mostly because George and Don were real excited, we set out to produce what you would now call a hypermedia system. Now, we didn't invent hypermedia systems, and in fact, there was another system around called the Promise system, which had a network of 30,000 frames, okay? And we essentially said, that's important from a computer science point of view. Let us create these guys are a bunch of medical characters. Let us create a version like that in the computer science world. And in fact, we actually helped then push the whole notion of hypermedia around. We attempted a major application. We did it. It's a little unclear for reasons I won't go into here whether it was a success or not. This was, in fact, putting a whole Zog system, which is this big hypertext network, putting a whole Zog system on the Carl Vincent carrier to help manage that carrier's operation. Again, in some sense, if you're going to go be diverted, get some use out of it. Get some general use out of it. What was there to salvage? Turns out there was only one thing to salvage that I could see. The one thing that happened in our getting into that was that a lot of people, 2, 3, something like that, a lot of people were really convinced that this network of 30,000, which they soon envisioned being 300,000 and so on, was essentially an artificial intelligence. Now, they were wrong. They were absolutely wrong. But that was when Bruce Waxman, one of the characters like this, who knew about this system, which was out of the computer science world, so it was way over on the side in the medical world, came to me, he said, that's where artificial intelligence really is. You ought to go understand it. Okay, what I learned out of this is there are no shortcuts to intelligence. Hypermedia has nothing to do with intelligence. It's not the nature of how humans think, and those are not connected anymore. But that's the one little lesson that I got. So what are the points of note? One of the peculiar ones, but it tells you something, is that all the diversions were for social reasons. Not a single diversion was for scientific reasons, although if you buy the maxim, once you're trapped in a diversion, make it count, okay? That really fits, by the way. If I'm devoted to trying to understand the nature of the human mind, what business do I have being getting diverted from scientific reasons? There got to be some other kind of reasons. And they all were. I like to help Raj and do things like that. All right. They all lasted a long time, but I always came back to the basic scientific issues, my basic scientific goal. All right. Well, there are other things besides diversions. I mean, desires and diversions, the talk is over. We've gotten through the title. That's all we have to do. Not quite. There are some other things. There are failures, for instance. So let's talk about failures. So the maxim here is embrace failure as part of success. I always like to say, one good failure a week is just bracing and good for you. Your problem is to use it to somehow advance towards the main goal, something I've not always been successful in doing. So now I want to tell you about a couple of failures. Here's the first one. It's a system called Mellon, which I did with Jim. You'll notice a subtle shift. In the previous thing where I talked about these diversions, the name came first and the project second. Now in these failures, the project comes first and the names come second, because it's the project that failed, not the people who were on it. All right. So this was an effort with Jim Moore, a graduate student here, Richard Young, who's now over in Cambridge, who was here as a research assistant with me. Again, it lasts for what? 6 or 7 years. There was a kernel idea behind Mellon, which was, again, the attempt to do the main line, namely that all thought was seeing one situation as some other further specified. So if you could see the current situation as the goal, just further specified in some ways, then you could see how to get to the goal. So everything was to be built on a generalized form of mapping in which you would sort of map everything into everything else, and the nature of those maps would, in fact, be the flow structure of thought. It was, in fact, a pretty hot idea, and it just had a whole cartload of interesting things. For instance, it had frames, schemas, had attached procedures, had general mapping in it, had notions of indefinite context dependence, had automatic compilation. Remember, this is all, Minsky's frames paper is 75. This is all several years before Minsky's frame paper. Had all these great things in. The only problem is we couldn't make it work, okay? That is, it failed. Now, I need to tell you what it means to say what a failure is. I don't mean that we didn't get a program to make it work. I don't mean that we didn't publish a paper on it. Things succeed in computer science when they affect the course of computer science. And if when you look back 5 years, there's no ripple at all from the papers you publish to the systems you build, that's a failure, okay? So my criteria of failure is the one we use in tenure committees, which is, let's just talk about the way this guy has pushed, or gal, has pushed computer science around. Don't look at the papers. Don't look at the systems. Only ask how they've pushed computer science around. So in fact, Mellon was really well noticed. It was talked about. It was referenced. It was cited. But it turns out that when you're through, it died. No one knows about Mellon now. Its ideas didn't have any issue. Things like the frames and so forth all came around, and this was a little input to them, but not the important input. So that counts as a real failure. Furthermore, we didn't even learn that the idea was wrong. It's a very seductive idea. May actually be right. Okay. I salvaged almost nothing. Almost nothing for my main goal, because in fact I couldn't even learn that the idea was wrong, except for one small technical idea which nobody except myself and you all in a moment will know about, which is that the way we constructed Mellon, which was a structure which was a mapping of something which, when you tried to map it on something else, would lead to building a further mapping and building a further mapping. These were called beta structures. Those were, in fact, local computationally. That is, the associated attached procedure to each mapping, which would be the compilation of how to actually make it work, was, in fact, the view from that point, and never a global view of what the entire cognitive context was. And so what I learned out of that was that we had, in some sense, produced the inverse system from what we wanted to produce. What we really wanted was a system with a single mind's eye. You'll all recognize production systems in that. With a single mind's eye that would somehow survey all of this, and not what we had in Mellon, which actually had production systems in, had little production systems all over this big mapping structure. Okay. Small but important technical idea. It's the only thing I took out of it. So let's have another failure. This is the biggest failure of all, by the way. This is something called the Instructable Production System Project. Lasted from 76 to 79. A lot of people worked on this. Lanny Forgey, John McDermott, Mike Rickner, John Laird, Paul Rosenblum as young graduate students. The basic idea was to grow production systems by external means. So as opposed to the designer having to know exactly the structure of rules, you'd sit on the outside and you'd loft rules into this system and it would sort of grow up, okay? We actually talked about it a lot as if the goal was to obtain a large production system. In those days, that was 1,000, not 10,000, okay? No one had reached it. No one was above 200. It was, in fact, a total failure. We never got off the ground. We never produced anything. One of the ways of illustrating this in terms of publications is there was a prospective paper and there was a retrospective paper, but there were no papers in between. It was so bad that only Mike Rickner, whose loyalty to the project was really very deep, was the only one who was willing to go off and write the retrospective paper. So a genuine failure, okay? And that's what I say, embrace them. Don't hide them. Be happy with them, all right? Now, it turns out that it had an incredible set of uses. So, in fact, the whole OPS series of production systems, OPS standing for Official Production System for the Instructable Production System Project, because we all had our own versions, was generated by this project. It turns out that as we struggled to find some tasks for which this poor benighted system, I have to tell you what's wrong with the system. Didn't tell you that. The real problem is, maybe I'll say it later, I can't remember. The real problem is that if you're sitting on the outside, you dump a production system in, you can't ever do anything to evoke that production. Production is up there someplace with its conditions. You don't know what it is because you don't know the productions that are in there. That's the whole point. And you're fishing around trying to find some way to make it fire, and you can't do that. So we could never get, it wasn't quite that bad, but it was almost that bad. We could never get a scheme which let the thing sort of turn over so you could shape it, okay? And trying to find some tasks like this, John McDermott picked up a task that Sam Fuller had at Digital Equipment, which turned out to be this VAX configuration task. And so the R1 expert system, which many of you will know because it was the first really successful commercial expert system, grew directly out of this project. The notion of universal weak methods, something that John Laird and I did, grew out of this project. And in fact, Mike went and had a fairly large influence around this campus in getting engineering AI going in engineering circles. So the yield from this failure was actually pretty good. So what did I salvage from this? Because success, that is yield, in terms of uses of the failure, sort of helps justify spending all those years, but it doesn't lead to the main line. So I salvaged essentially several important things. This was the launching pad. This failure was the launching pad for SOAR. It was out of this that we understood that you had to do something, here it is, that you had to do something with productions as sort of a flat organization. You needed to put another organization on top of it. That organization turned out to be problem spaces. We also understood that you needed default methods so that when the system wasn't dealing with your productions that you threw in there, it would always have something that would keep it turning over. That turned out to be the universal weak method. Both of these turned out to be central in SOAR. So it was, in fact, the launching pad. So the yield was actually pretty good. The only remark I would make about both of these failures is, again, failures can last a long time. If you look at that, that's a lot of years. If you look at the other one, wherever is the other one, that's even more years. So again, long life helps. Now, there's just 2 failures. I don't want you to believe that I only had 2 failures in my life, so I'm not going to go over them, but there's another list of failures which I could talk about if we really want to come back and focus on my failures. But diversions and failures are not the only things to worry about in trying to achieve that scientific goal. There are successes on sub-problems and the fact that these become abandoned opportunities. So the maxim is, if you're going to go for this goal, then you got to solve whatever problems are in the way of whatever character, okay? So you solve whatever problems must be solved. And if you're successful on those, then your problem is not to be seduced by them, because these will be big successes. Let me give you some examples. List processing is one, okay? Now, lists are viewed now as a hot idea. I mean, a little old by now. But in those days, nobody believed them, especially the programming systems community. But in fact, they had in it the ideas of list processing as developed early, so this is back in the 1950s. They not only had lists, they had the concept of dynamic resource allocation, they had the notion of data types, they had the full notion of recursion, they had the notion of generators and working with streams. All of those programming concepts were in here, and in fact, after a few years of working, the notion of lists turned out to be very important. As you know, Lisp is important. Big success. The real issue is you can't be seduced into now devoting your life to list processing since it's such a success. And I succeeded in this one, in fact, in the whole efflorescence of a scientific literature on list programming, mostly built around Lisp, but that's irrelevant here, like the FUNOG problem and all the rest of those things. I never participated in this at all. I don't think I ever wrote another article on Lisp processing. So I was not seduced away from my main goal because of the success of Lisp processing. Let's have another one. Hashing. So it turns out that this is not long-lived. This is sort of a month of July in '61. And it turns out that someplace on Long Island or something like this, I can't remember, Marvin Minsky and I happened to be together sitting down with some obnoxious fellow who kept insisting that the only way you're going to build systems that have the right properties is to not program them, but to build new hardware systems, okay? And so sort of there in over the dinner play, we didn't invent, because I'll tell you the rest of the story in a moment, but we sort of used hashing, which was not called hashing at the time, to show that you could do with software direct associative addressing, and you didn't have to build associative machines, which is what this guy was plugging. You could do it all with software, okay? And this was essentially my contribution to this dinner. It turns out that hashing had been invented a couple of years before by a bunch of characters working on a disk system called the RAMAC, in which, in order to deal with the accessing problems, they had invented some clumsy version of hashing. Again, not called hashing. I can't remember what they actually called it. They may have called it scrambled addressing, because that's what I called it. And it took that idea in this very special context, generalized it, saw all the implications of it. It was quite clear what all the kinds of things hashing could do for you in the programming world. But again, I controlled myself. I wrote one unpublished paper on this. This is a historical lie, but it'll do for the purpose of this talk. Sent it off to Knuth to put in his book, and then went on from there. Even though it was clear how important hashing was, and in fact, one could have gone off down that hashing line, inventing and developing that technology would have been a fairly thoroughly satisfactory research career. Let me give you another one, protocol analysis. So this is kind of long-lasting. This sort of goes from 60 to 72, which is a fairly long time. Turns out that one needs, as a sub-project, to go understand the nature of the mind, an appropriate form of data. And the idea behind protocol analysis is to use the natural language content of people talking about what's going through their mind at the time that they talk. And in the course of working with these early cognitive programs, Herb and I sort of really used that data effectively and reestablished it. It had all been sort of dumped off as the notion of introspection. Introspection was unreliable. We sort of reestablished this. This is a great idea and has in fact made a very large impact in cognitive psychology and cognitive science. I did not follow up on that. What was needed at that point was methodological studies, an attempt to turn protocol analysis into a real engine of research with reliabilities and all the rest of that junk, okay? And I just didn't do that. Now, I'd like to take complete credit, but I did, in fact, right after this period, engage in a period of automatic protocol analysis. That's one of my failures. That came to naught. And so I did not, in fact, abandon things the way I should have, but allowed myself to be seduced into believing that I ought to continue to spend parts of my life on protocol analysis. Now, the fact that when I list my vita and all the rest of this stuff, I say, oh, what have I done with my life? Well, I've been all involved in list processing and protocol analysis, and those are two big things. That shouldn't confuse you. All right? I mean, that's just for PR. Okay? What counts is how are you doing with respect to understanding the nature of the mind. And these things are key sub-problems that have to be solved. But as they turn out to be successful, and these certainly were successful, then you got to, in some sense, you got to know to abandon them, give up all the opportunities they offer. I should go talk to Scott Fallman, I'm sure. Give up. That's too deep for most of you, except that Scott has balanced his life between neural nets and working on common lists, and he faced exactly these issues. And he and I ought to talk about that sometime. All right. I got one more. Success. This is the whole issue of the efficiency of production systems. What are you going to do when you got 100,000 productions? How are you going to be able to select those rules in a tenth of a second or a hundredth of a second? Now, in fact, we've been working on this from '76, and we're still working on it, so this is really long-lived. There are, in fact, a whole set of important ideas that have developed. This is a little area within the issue now of parallel processing, of the read algorithm, fine-grained parallelism, expensive chunks, unique attributes. Haven't abandoned it yet because we haven't gotten the success out of it that we need so that all of our big production systems are working successfully on parallel processors. I hope I have the courage to abandon it when that time comes. So the points I want to note about this is success can last a long time too, not just failures. But you should never ultimately be diverted. And then that remark that I made earlier, it does help to have a long life because you're going to have 10-year diversions and 10-year successes on some problems. You've got to have some time to come back and work on the main thing. So I'm finally through with all of those, but I need to talk just about success a little bit. So here is successes and their cultivation. And there are two maxims associated with this. One, when you make a success, when you get an insight into the essential problem that you're working on, you'll preserve it. Don't let it go. You work on it and deepen it. In fact, any really deep idea is going to transform itself radically over time and requires the kind of care and tending for that to happen. The reason that's so important is that deep scientific ideas are exceedingly simple, and almost everyone else will see them as trivial. Okay, consequently, you'll be the only one to be able to cultivate them for a number of years. So here's a list of what I consider to be sort of essential good ideas. Kind of unimportant what the list is: list processing, search, symbols, problem spaces, weak methods, production systems, knowledge level, chunking, impasses, all of which, almost all of which, the story isn't quite the same for each one of them, all of which have this property that they are simple ideas, and that over the years, each one of these becomes deeper and transforms itself. And I'm only going to give you a single example of that. So here's the issue of problem spaces. I could have picked several other ones, although this was sort of probably the best one to illustrate it. This idea is so trivial as to be uninteresting to almost everybody I know, okay? Which is to say it sort of says if you're going to do search, you ought to do it in a state space. State spaces, what's the big deal? We all know what state spaces are. They're spaces which have states and transitions between them. That's all that's to be said about it, except they're kind of a useful formalism. So what is a problem space? A problem space is a set of states and a set of operators from state to state, and you have a problem if they go from some initial state to any of a set of desired, to one of a set of desired states by applying that sequence of operators. All seems fairly straightforward. But now look what's happened over time. In 1957, when this idea first showed up, it was that a search space was the appropriate thing to do heuristic combinatorial search. That is, we were just discovering in AI that there was a combinatorial search problem, and that you had to kind of modulate that with heuristics, and that's why it wasn't called the problem space quite then. It was simply called the search space. That was the initial idea. By 1965, this idea had transmuted into that is the space in which all problem solving occurs. That is, when you look at any difficult problem solving, it always occurs in some problem space. That wasn't clear up here at all. There were just some problems that were formulated this way. Okay? So that's a significant change. In a few years later, I can't quite pin down the date, the idea surfaced, the idea was finally understood that unlike simple little AI programs, real human intelligence has such a huge body of knowledge that its problem is that for any task it wants to do, it must select out a small arena in which to do this task, and it must get rid of almost everything else that it wants to do. So there is a deliberate limitation to an arena. And the problem space is the notion that relates to how the human limits the arena. Whether, in fact, it used it for search or not is irrelevant. There's this notion of limiting the arena because the human can do so many other things that it couldn't possibly, in some sense, consider all of them or bring all of that knowledge or ask about all of that knowledge. It's got to impose, and this is done deliberately, of course, so it can change that arena and work on a problem differently. By 1979, this notion had gotten enriched because it wasn't just problem solving. That should have been not the area, it should have been the arena again, in which the problem space was the organization in which all cognitive activity was supposed to occur, was to occur. Okay, these are all hypotheses, of course, about the nature of human behavior, hypotheses which most of the rest of the AI and cognitive world is not paying much attention to. This concept is sort of getting deeper and deeper as it goes along. So that shift from just problem solving to all cognitive behavior, routine and otherwise, to be accomplished within problem spaces. It seems incredible now that all the way through this, one only talked about single problem spaces. And so the idea got changed in 1983 with essentially the development of impassing and universal subgoaling and SOAR, to the fact that one now had multiple problem spaces, and that the relationship between those problem spaces was not implementation, but was a lack of knowledge in this problem space about how to do things would lead to the setting up of another problem space. And so that enriched the notion of the role of problem spaces in cognitive behavior. There was now to be a whole web of them. What is, I think, the biggest transformation occurred in 1987, in which problem spaces all of a sudden turned out to be a least commitment program control construct. Okay? Let me try and explain that. It turns out that what you want in an intelligent system is not to commit yourself in advance to how you're going to control things, but to wait to the very last minute to assemble the knowledge right then in order to do control. And so if you separate all of control knowledge from all of the things you can do, the operators, that is a problem space. So here it is having nothing to do with search at all, but being fundamentally a control construct. And the way we arrived at this actually was by observation of SOAR, in which, having been imbued with search all the way through this, we sort of looked at SOAR, and SOAR most of the time wasn't doing any search. And when you ask, well, what was the problem space doing all of that time, the answer was it was being this controls construct of delaying to the moment of action the assembly of control knowledge that might have been generated just a little bit before in order to do the control at that point. But we're not through yet. In 1990, which is sort of this is actually a little odd in time, but I'll just let it go. The idea that an intelligence system has the problem of how it formulates tasks out of nothing. Where do tasks come from? The programming world says a task comes because a human has a task and it puts that task into a program. Therefore, don't ask. Child, be quiet. Tasks come from humans. We don't ever have to ask how they come. But if you're talking about what is the nature of human cognition, you must say, how does a human who doesn't have a task arrive at that task in the first place? And it turns out that the problem space becomes a device for how to formulate tasks out of nothing, in addition to all of these others. And then the last one has a question mark because we know it's there, but it's totally undeveloped. The problem space is a generalized device for error recovery, which is to say that there I am in this problem space, which is a search space, and anytime an error happens, I am already embedded in a larger context in which I can consider alternatives. So that error recovery becomes a very different kind of situation than it is in most programming systems. That is an undeveloped idea, but I assure you it's there. So here's one simple construct. Yet over time, by nurturing it, it has turned out to be an exceedingly rich construct, and I assume it's going to go on. It's going to go on from there. There's a similar story that can be told for some of the others. I'm not looking at my watch anyway, but I assume I don't have time to talk about those. So let's talk about choosing the final project. The maxim here is choose a final project that will outlast you. My best example of this is an economist by the name of Fritz Machlup. Fritz was a fairly famous economist at Princeton. Had worked in all kinds of areas in economics, had published in 1962 a book called Knowledge and Its Distribution in the United States, which was sort of trying to show there really was a knowledge industry, and from an economic point of view, you really ought to track the knowledge. Okay, you ought to characterize it and do statistical studies on it and so forth. When Fritz retired from Princeton at the usual retirement time, he said, what I want to do is to write an 8-volume study, which is going to have, it's like the Knuth issue, right? It's going to have a volume for every chapter of the previous book, which really treats this right, okay? Now, as time went on, that got expanded to be a 10-volume study and so forth. And when Fritz had a heart attack at age 80, he was up to volume 4, and he clearly had succeeded in picking a project which outlasted him, and so he died with his pen in his hand, which is exactly the right way to die, okay? So that's one thing, and the other maxim I would have you attend to is that everything must wait until it's time. Science is genuinely the art of the possible, and that's going to be reflected in this list. So SOAR seems like a typical final project, especially if you see it now, in which it's clearly going to outlast me, all right? Look what has to be done for SOAR. A couple of these we've done, but most of them we haven't. It's got to have the right architecture. It's got to learn continuously from experience. It's got to communicate with the external world easily. Okay, so that's some years from now. It's got to learn continuously from its environment, not just from its internal experience, which is sort of what it does now. It's got to live a long time, okay? Maybe not 10 to the 9th decision cycles, but 10 to the 7th decision cycles at least, okay? It's got to, people keep telling it, it's got to embody all of its tasks simultaneously. You can't build one SOAR system for this and one SOAR system for that. You've got to put everything in the same thing, because that's what's true of human cognition. It's got to become very large. It's got to have 10 to the 5 or 10 to the 6 productions or associations or whatever you call them. We're only up to 10,000, barely started. it has to have a sense of history and place. In the modern terms, it's got to be situated, okay? It's got to be a system with a sense of self. It's got to learn from a social community. All of these things are real problems. All of them, if I take Werner Reichert's view, are each worth 5 years, all right? So clearly I don't have a chance, okay? Someplace down in here, it's all over. So it will surely outlast me, and so I've essentially done exactly what Fritz Mach done, except that's all not true. SOAR is not a final project. It's simply the next project that comes along. In fact, if you look at the time it was chosen, which was 83, I was only 56 at the time, much too early to be choosing final projects. The choice, however, was strategic. It was finally coming back and picking as a goal all of the things that were focused on that central desire to understand the nature of the human mind. The fact that you see such a massive commitment to it is really, I won't go through this because we already have kind of, it's really the fact that it turns out to be a confluence of so many things that seem right. All right. So that's about it. So I sort of sprinkled throughout this thing a bunch of maxims, which I think, at least when I hear myself saying them to my graduate students, I think that they probably characterize my own scientific life. So the maximum that holds for this last slide is to each scientific style its own maxims. The maxims that I've told you about don't necessarily apply to other scientific styles. On the other hand, there are in fact a bunch of maxims which didn't quite make it in to that particular way of viewing my scientific life, and I thought that a suitable sort of tattered way of ending this talk would be to just go over some of the other maxims that I have found useful and that, in fact, I think are entirely appropriate for the scientific style in which I've lived, but not necessarily other ones. So here's the first one. So this is a random collection. This is a random residual. First one, if you want to work with the results of field X, you've got to be a professional in X. To wit, no interdisciplinary activities. And I've got some good examples of this. In cognitive psychology, which was central for me, is central for me in understanding the nature of human cognition, I had to become a cognitive psychologist. I couldn't depend upon my cognitive psychological friends. Okay, now, in fact, what that means, as some of the psychologists around here will verify, is psychologists have a way of dealing with issues. They sit there and they sort of shout studies at each other. And one person says, the study by so-and-so shows this. And you've got to respond, oh, but that study is flawed in this particular way. To where someone else says, but this study shows this. And you say, but I have another study which shows this. Okay, now, in fact, that's the way cognitive psychologists talk when they're together. If you can't talk that way, if it turns out that you don't know essentially every study that's laid on the conversational table, you are not a cognitive psychologist. So being a cognitive psychologist means to immerse yourself so deeply in cognitive psychology that you can play that game. And I did, and I do play that game. Okay? I got a bunch of interesting anecdotes I won't tell you but could about that. On the other hand, the linguists play a different game. They play a game of making up counterexamples. They make up these interesting sentences which they zing at each other across the table. And you have to deal in real time online with all those counterexamples by making up other counterexamples of your own or denying, in fact, that that's grammatical or whatever. Okay? Very different game from what the cognitive psychologists do. Now, it turns out, well, I don't know about the neuropsychologists. They're so embedded in anatomical language that I can't even follow them, it turns out. But it turns out that this one I did, and these two I didn't. And so consequently, I have never, and been crippled this way, I have never in all of my professional life really dealt with linguistics adequately, and I certainly have been unwilling to deal with brain-damaged patients and studies and information and so forth, what's now called neurocognitive psychology, simply because in some sense I wasn't a professional in either of these areas, and so it wasn't safe for me to go use them. And I think this is true. I don't believe it when they tell you that what you need to do is to collaborate with a psychologist and he will do this for you, or she will do this for you. They won't and they can't. If you want to work across fields, you become professionals in both fields. Second one, we are all flawed, okay? We all carry our burden of incapacities, and the real thing about that is you want to know them like the back of your hand, and you don't want to fight them. In my own case, the issue is I'm not a mathematician. Now, I know I'm not a mathematician because, in fact, I spent a year as a graduate student at Princeton in Fine Hall, which is the temple of pure mathematics, okay? And I came away from that understanding that I was never going to be a real mathematician. I was never going to prove any of those deep theorems. In fact, I was never going to prove any of those undeep theorems, okay? And I have designed my scientific life, in some sense, to simply deal with that. I don't fight it. I know that I'm limited in that respect, and so I work with the things where I'm strong. I understand my flaws, and I stay away from them. Here's a hard one. There is no substitute for working hard, very hard, okay? I tell this to my graduate students all the time. Just like in professional sports, in professional music, on the concert stage, and so forth, the people who are out there and are going to get the goal, the people who are going to find out what the nature of the mind is the people who are not only brilliant and creative, but work very hard. And you can be as brilliant as you want and as creative as you want, and if you don't work hard, someone's going to get there first. Okay, and it's a hard story, but it's just very, very true. If you don't want to work that hard, don't go after this scientific style of picking up one of these goals. And you look around and you see that that's really true about the scientists who have made those kind of goals. And it just comes out of this notion of competition at the margin of excellence. I mean, that's all that's going on. It's just as true of professional sports as it is science. But unfortunately, it's just as true of science as it is of professional sports. All right. So how do new things get started? In all of the experience I've had, they always get started by evolution. That is, we're in a situation like that big failure, and out of that failure comes the ashes, which tell that instructable production system problem, which tell you how to proceed next. That happens all the time in every scientific endeavor. Or they come from chance. I didn't ask Oliver Selfridge to visit that day. Oliver arrives. I didn't know him from Adam. He gives his talk. There I am. I'm hooked for the rest of my life. Okay, they do not happen by design. I have designed a large number of starts in my life. Almost all of them have gone down the tubes. So I designed this instructable production system project. Didn't work. So the next problem, okay, so that's all. So here's another version that I feel most deeply about. A scientist is a transducer from nature to theory. Don't kid yourself that you have very much to offer. Your problem is to go listen to nature, transduce what it has to say into a theory, but don't believe that the theory is coming from you. It's coming from nature. So the name of the game is to seek out nature and listen to her. Back in the 60s, whenever I used to go home kind of depressed because I felt I hadn't learned anything in a week, I would take a new protocol, and I would take an evening and I would clear the evening away. And I'd spend an evening with that protocol, and I would always find out something about human behavior that I didn't know. Okay, just listen to nature. Those of you who, to hear me say on SOAR, listen to the architecture, it's just a version of that same maxim. This is simply my version of Herb's Have a Secret Weapon. Here the secret weapon is every scientist should have a piece of nature that nobody else knows about, that you can listen to, that tells you what to do. I don't know what the mathematicians do on that. But then I'm not a mathematician, you see. All right. So here's the last one. The science is in the technique. All else is commentary. All right? All that lives in science are those techniques, based on theory, of course, but are those techniques which your scientific descendants must use to solve their problems. We know about Hamilton because there's a thing called the Hamiltonian, and there's just a bunch of problems in physics which you wish to formulate with Hamiltonians. Okay? And we don't know about a bunch of other characters because their formulations were either too general or they weren't interesting enough. So it's the techniques that you build that really count. And all the general theories and the points of view and the commentaries on them are all fluff, and they don't really count, okay? And so you got to keep that in mind. For instance, to pick an example, I had a fellow on the SOAR project who went to a meeting recently, and he came back and he said, everyone there is all enthused about connectionism, okay? And he says, I need to write an article to tell them about these other kinds of architectures so they won't be so enthused about connectionism. And I said, forget it. I said it a little nicer than that. But I said, forget it, because in fact that paper is just talk. That paper is not science, no matter how good it is, and even if you persuade a few people. The real issue is, what techniques will you build that your descendants will have to use to solve their problems? And in fact, if you look over my scientific career, you will see a whole number of places, like the GOMS models, where we, and problem behavior graphs, which I didn't talk about here, where we deliberately attempted to package our scientific results as techniques that could be used by future generations of scientists. Sometimes we were a success, sometimes we weren't. I'm not going to talk about this, but I will sort of say what it's all about. This sort of says that if you have an urge to talk generally, sort of do it at invited talks like this one, or do it on the banquet circuit. Don't kid yourself that these general papers are in fact the stuff out of which your real science is made. So that's sort of it. I could have actually started out this whole talk by giving a maxim from my father. My father was a great maxim maker. And I suppose I should say it the way Lyndon Johnson did, you know, what my daddy told me, okay? And what he used to say is, and he said it incessantly, he always says, keep your eye on the main chance, okay? And if I'd have started out with that maxim, then I probably wouldn't have even had a talk to give, because that's sort of the maxim that covers all of the things that I've said in this talk.